I want you to picture a scene with me. But we actually need to completely erase whatever image you currently have in your head when you think about the birth of modern science.
Right, yeah. Like forget the pristine white coats and the clean labs.
Exactly. Forget the brightly lit laboratories filled with tidy chalkboards, polite applause from other academics. Instead, I want you to imagine the dead of night over Cambridge, England.
And it's late.
Yeah, the night is actually stretched so far that it's bleeding into this pale, sickly morning. And we are standing inside a stifling, hot, soot-stained wooden shed right at the very edge of the courtyard of Trinity College.
It's just a miserable environment.
Totally unbreathable. And standing in the middle of this toxic air, squatting in front of the roaring maw of a brick furnace, is Isaac Newton.
It is a genuinely visceral, uncomfortable scene to think about. I mean, the only light hitting Newton's face is this restless, angry glow from a melting pot.
Wow.
And his face is the color of ash. His cheeks are completely sunken in from what looks like, well, weeks of sheer exhaustion.
Because he hasn't been sleeping.
Right. And his eyes are bloodshot, just totally ravaged by these heavy, yellowish fumes of sulfur and mercury that are lazily drifting out of the oven.
But he's not just observing this stuff from a distance. He grabs a pair of heavy iron tongs, and he carefully tilts this glass vessel filled with a thick, dark liquid that actually bubbles and hisses as it hits the air.
Yeah, this is the craziest part to me.
It's insane. He puts the tongs down, takes an acid-burned index finger, because his hands are literally eaten away by corrosive chemicals at this point, and he dips it into the cooled residue on the rim. And then he puts it right into his mouth.
He tastes it.
He actually tastes it. It's this sharp, overwhelming metallic sludge of raw mercury mixed with antimony. He coughs, gripping the table just to stay standing.
And here is the realization that completely, I think, shatters our modern perspective on him. He isn't waiting for an apple to fall. He isn't looking for gravity. He is staring into that boiling sludge, desperately searching for what he called the spiritus vegetativus.
The invisible, divine fire that animates dead matter.
Exactly. He is looking for literal magic.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking you on a really profound journey into an incredible piece of writing by Saad Dolenk from Anatomia Vednosti, which means The Anatomy of Knowledge, published in Farkadabra.
It's a fantastic source.
It really is.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to completely, fundamentally dismantle the myth of Isaac Newton as the cold, rational architect of the Enlightenment.
Because that myth is just so entrenched in how we teach science.
It is. We're going to explore how his total obsession with alchemy, his fixation on biblical prophecy, and his secret, highly illegal religious heresies were just, weird little side hobbies.
They weren't distractions from his physics.
Exactly. They were the very engine that made modern science possible. Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you're listening right now, you're probably taught, just like I was, that Newton was the ultimate poster child for pure cold logic.
The guy who replaced superstition with math.
Right. And to understand how wrong that is, we have to fast forward from that toxic wooden shed all the way to London, to the summer of 1936.
A huge jump in time.
Yeah, we're in the elegant, refined halls of Sotheby's auction house. John Maynard Keynes, the world-famous economist and really one of the most brilliant rational minds of the 20th century, has just purchased a massive, completely unknown stack of original manuscripts written by Isaac Newton.
So imagine you're Keynes in this moment. You are the champion of modern economic rationalism.
You're a numbers guy.
A total numbers guy. And you've just bought the secret papers of the man who essentially invented the scientific method. When you take these back to your quiet, comfortable study to unroll them, you expect to find the blueprints of reality.
Right, you're anticipating clean geometry.
Exactly. Celestial mechanics, cold, hard, beautiful equations.
But when Keynes actually spreads these yellowed pages out on his desk, and they're covered in Newton's tiny, pedantic handwriting, the first thing that hits him isn't the genius of the math.
It's the smell.
Yes. The paper literally smells like soot and ancient chemicals. And when he starts reading, there are no physics equations. He's looking at intricate, hand-drawn pictures of dragons swallowing their own tails.
He finds illustrations of green lions devouring the sun, mysterious hermaphroditic figures, and thousands of pages dedicated to incredibly complex alchemical recipes for distilling toxic metals.
It's wild.
It gets crazier. He finds manic, sprawling calculations where Newton is trying to figure out the exact architectural dimensions of King Solomon's temple from the Bible.
Like an architectural floor plan.
Yeah, and pages trying to decode apocalyptic ciphers hidden in the Book of Revelation.
So Keynes sits there, running his fingers over this rough paper, realizing with a mounting sense of shock that he is not reading the words of the first scientist.
The myth just evaporates for him.
Completely. Keynes realizes, and he later famously writes this, that he's looking at the writings of the last of the magicians, the last magus.
It's a powerful quote.
It really is. But hold on, this is where I really struggle, and I suspect anyone listening to this deep dive is struggling too. How do we reconcile the guy who figured out universal gravity, the guy whose math literally put human beings on the moon centuries later, with the guy who is locked in a shed drawing magical green lions and trying to decode the apocalypse?
It feels completely contradictory.
It feels like two completely different human beings inhabiting the same skull.
It does feel that way to us, but that's because we are projecting our modern biases backward in time. To understand Newton, we have to completely abandon our modern categories.
Okay, how so?
Well, today we look at physics and magic as polar opposites. We look at calculus and biblical prophecy as entirely different, incompatible universes. But this is the core philosophical foundation of our entire deep dive today. Newton's mind was not split.
He didn't compartmentalize it.
No, not at all. He didn't have a rational day job and an irrational weekend hobby. To Isaac Newton, physics, mathematics, alchemy, and the scriptures were simply different dialects of the exact same language.
Wait, so he thought doing math and reading the Bible were the exact same activity?
Essentially, yes. They were both tools used to read the mind of God. He believed the universe was a cryptogram set by the Almighty. And whether you were decoding the orbit of a comet or the prophecies in the book of Daniel, you were doing the exact same work.
That is fascinating.
And here's the really crucial part. His greatest scientific achievement, the universal law of gravitation, didn't happen in spite of his obsession with magic and theology. It happened because of it.
Because of the magic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Without those terrifying nights breathing in fumes by the alchemical furnace, without his mystical search for invisible spiritual forces, the mathematical mechanism that defined modern science might never have existed.
Okay, that is a wild claim.
Yeah.
And to understand why the greatest mathematician in history needed to boil mercury and search for magic to invent physics, we have to go back to the moment where the legend says modern science was actually born. We have to go back to the apple orchard.
Right. We are going back to 1665. The Great Plague is sweeping through London, and it's devastating the population.
A terrifying time to be alive.
Extremely. The University of Cambridge is forced to lock its doors, and Isaac Newton, who is only 22 years old at this time, has to flee the city. He retreats to the safety and total isolation of his family's rural estate, Woolsthorpe, in Lincolnshire.
And this begins what historians of science call, with absolute reference, the annus mirabilis, the miracle year.
Yeah, he is in complete isolation. He's far away from his professors. He's away from the university library. He has no colleagues to bounce ideas off of.
It's just him and his brain.
And his brain just detonates. It is an explosion of pure creativity that might be entirely unmatched in human history.
Let's list what he actually did, because it's staggering. In the span of roughly 18 months, this 22-year-old kid invents an entirely new branch of mathematics, what we now call infinitesimal calculus.
Which is mind-blowing on its own.
Right. That he takes a glass prism and proves that pure white light is actually composed of the entire color spectrum. And of course, the legend says he is sitting in the orchard outside the house, he sees an apple fall from a branch, and his mind suddenly scales up from that falling fruit all the way to the moon, giving birth to the idea of universal gravity.
But let me stop you right there, because we use words like calculus and gravity so casually today that we forget how alien they were.
True.
Like, why did he even need to invent a new math? Wasn't the math they had in the 1600s good enough?
No, it absolutely was not. The math of the 1600s, algebra and classical geometry, was perfect for static objects. If you wanted to measure a triangle, or a square field, or a building that is standing perfectly still, classical geometry was fine.
Because nothing is changing.
Exactly. But the universe isn't static. An apple falling from a tree isn't just dropping at a constant speed. It is accelerating. It's moving faster in its second of falling than in its first.
Right, it's gaining momentum.
And planets aren't moving in straight lines, they are constantly curving. Algebra just couldn't handle continuous fluid change.
So calculus is essentially the mathematics of motion. It's the math of curves and rates of change.
You nailed it. He had to invent a mathematical language that could measure reality while reality was moving. And once he had that tool, he applied it to the falling apple and the orbiting moon. He realizes that whatever invisible tether is pulling the apple to the dirt is the exact same tether pulling the moon around the Earth.
But here is the critical problem. And it's the reason why the legend we are taught in school is so misleading.
Yeah. The myth tells us that the apple falls, the light bulb goes off, he writes down the equations, and modern physics is born right then and there.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. Here's where it gets really interesting. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't publish it. He didn't run into the town square shouting, "Eureka!"
Which is what you'd expect.
Of course. Instead, he took the single greatest scientific discovery in the history of the human species, the literal mathematical code of the cosmos, and he shoved it into a drawer. And he left it in that drawer for almost 20 years.
It seems completely incomprehensible to us. But Newton, despite his youth, possessed a terrifying level of self-awareness regarding his own work. He knew exactly what the fatal flaw in his discovery was.
He knew he was missing something.
Exactly. He had the math. He had the formula that described the gravitational pull, what we call the inverse square law.
Let's explain that real quick for the listener, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The inverse square law basically means that gravity gets weaker the further away you get, but not in a simple straight line, right?
Right. It means if you move an object twice as far away from the Earth, the gravitational pull doesn't just become half as strong, it becomes 1/4 as strong. And if you move it 3 times as far away, the pull is 1/9 as strong. It drops off exponentially. Newton had this beautiful, elegant mathematical formula that perfectly predicted the orbits, but he completely lacked the physical or philosophical meaning behind it.
He didn't know the why.
Or the how. He had no idea how such a pull was physically possible.
It's like having the blueprints for a smartphone. Imagine I hand you the exact schematics, you know exactly how the microchips should be arranged, you know exactly how the screen should be built, but you live in the 1600s.
You'd have no idea what to do with it.
Exactly. You have absolutely no concept of what electricity is, and you have no idea how invisible radio signals can travel through empty air. Oh, you have the math, but how the physical mechanism is completely absent.
That is a perfect way to look at it. He knew the math worked on paper. But think about what he is actually suggesting to his peers. He is saying that the Earth can reach out across millions of miles of completely empty, dead space and grab hold of the moon, pulling it in a circle without any ropes, without any gears, without physically touching it in any way.
It sounds insane.
To a 17th century mind, that doesn't sound like science. It sounds like literal witchcraft.
Imagine if I'm standing across the room from you right now and I wave my hand and your coffee cup flies off the table. You don't call me a physicist. You call an exorcist.
Right, because things don't just move on their own.
Because the most basic, fundamental rule of reality that we observe every single day is that things have to touch in order to move. If I want to move a chair, I have to push it.
And this brings us to the intellectual rock star of this era, the man who defined what science was supposed to be in the 1600s, René Descartes. Yeah. If Newton had the math for gravity, why couldn't he just publish it, shrug his shoulders, say it's an invisible force, and let the world deal with it? Because to say invisible force in the 1660s was intellectual suicide.
Because Descartes had essentially banished magic from the academic world?
Yeah, he absolutely had. We really have to understand the universe that Descartes had built to understand what Newton was up against. Descartes envisioned the universe as a massive, flawless, perfectly engineered, clockwork mechanism.
A machine.
A total machine. In Descartes' universe, there is absolutely no room for miracles. There's no room for mysteries, and there's certainly no room for invisible magical forces acting across empty space. Everything that happens, from the orbit of massive planets down to a leaf falling from a tree in autumn, happens strictly because of direct physical contact.
So it's essentially a giant cosmic pinball machine.
Completely. The Cartesian universe is completely filled with invisible particles of matter. Descartes didn't believe in a true vacuum. He thought space was filled with an invisible fluid called the ether.
Okay, the ether.
Right. And these particles and etheric whirlpools are constantly bumping into each other, crashing together, transferring momentum like billiard balls. The moon orbits the Earth because invisible physical whirlpools of ether are literally pushing it around. If things aren't physically touching, they aren't moving. Period.
And for the intellectual elites of Europe at the time, this Cartesian pinball machine was everything. This was the ultimate triumph of human reason. They felt like they had finally scrubbed the universe clean of all the messy, terrifying medieval superstition.
No more ghosts.
No more ghosts, no more demons moving the planets around. It's just matter crashing into matter. It's clean, it's logical. But for Newton looked at Descartes' beautiful, perfect clockwork universe, and he wasn't relieved. He was completely horrified.
He was deeply disgusted by it. To the elites, Descartes' mechanical universe was the triumph of reason. To Isaac Newton, it was hidden atheism. It was a theological nightmare.
Wait, I need you to connect those dots for me because that feels like a big leap. Why does a mechanical universe equal atheism? If God built the clock, why is that an insult to God?
Because if the universe is just an automatic clockwork machine that runs perfectly on its own simply by particles bouncing off each other, then God is essentially a retired clockmaker.
Oh, I see.
He wound up the universe at the beginning of time, set the initial conditions, stepped back, and now he has absolutely nothing to do. The universe is dead. The matter is passive. It's just blindly ricocheting. God has no active role in the daily operations of reality.
God is just an absentee landlord.
Exactly.
For a zealot like Newton, the idea that God is locked out of his own creation is an existential threat.
Precisely. So let's go back to that stifling, toxic wooden shed at Trinity College. His retreat into alchemy wasn't a distraction. It wasn't him taking a break from real science to play wizard. It was a desperate rebellion against a dead universe.
Our rescue mission.
It was a theological rescue mission. He was not looking for a cheap recipe to turn lead into gold so he could get rich. He was conducting profound theological and physical research.
Okay, so he's mixing sulfur and mercury. He's watching these violent, explosive reactions in his glass vessels. What is he actually seeing in those pots that Descartes' math couldn't explain?
He's seeing spontaneous transformation. The source material highlights him watching these beautiful, intricate crystal trees growing out of metallic solutions right before his eyes.
Wow.
He's staring at this chemical growth, this almost biological behavior in dead metals, and he's thinking, Descartes' mechanical pinball universe cannot explain this. Dead, passive matter bouncing off each other cannot spontaneously organize into complex crystal trees. Something else is driving this.
He is searching for what alchemists called active principles.
Yes. Active principles are invisible, intangible forces that breathe life, movement, and attraction into dead matter without needing to physically touch it. He was looking for the hidden divine fire in the very heart of the atom.
Proof that God is still there.
Exactly. He needed to prove that God wasn't retired. He needed physical, chemical proof that God was actively, constantly present in every single particle of the universe, causing matter to attract, repel, and transform.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is precisely this deeply mystical, magical belief that the universe is permeated by invisible spiritual forces that don't obey mechanical billiard ball rules, that finally allowed his mind to accept his own mathematical discovery of gravity.
Yes, the connection is right there.
The math of the falling apple was just math, but his alchemical worldview allowed him to see it as an invisible, active principle reaching out across the void. The magic made the physics acceptable to his own brain.
That is the crucial insight. Descartes could never have discovered gravity because Descartes' philosophy wouldn't allow for invisible attraction. Newton's alchemy gave him the philosophical permission to believe his own equations.
Okay, but this raises a really important question for me. We're talking about a guy willing to burn his own fingers off, breathe toxic heavy metal fumes for decades, and operate in total secrecy just to prove a theological point.
It's extreme behavior.
Very extreme. Where does this intense, almost terrifying level of religious conviction come from? Why is he so obsessed?
To understand the paranoia and the obsession, we have to look at the very beginning of his life. We have to look at the primal trauma. Isaac Newton was born prematurely. He was incredibly frail, small enough to fit inside a quart mug, according to the local stories.
A quart mug? That is tiny.
Barely clinging to life. And he was born on a very specific date, Christmas Day, 1642.
Okay, the symbolism there is incredibly heavy.
It is. Now add to this the profound tragedy of his early life. His biological father died a few months before he was born. When Isaac was just 3 years old, his mother remarried a wealthy clergyman who didn't want a stepson.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she moved away and essentially abandoned Isaac, leaving him to be raised by his grandparents.
That is a staggering primal wound. You're fatherless, and your mother abandons you as a toddler. The psychological impact of that has to be massive.
Psychologically, this deep trauma of abandonment, combined with the heavy symbolic weight of being born on Christmas Day, birthed in Newton a massive messiah complex.
Really? A messiah complex?
Totally.
Huh.
He did not view himself as just a smart kid who was good at geometry. He deeply, genuinely believed that God had miraculously kept him alive as a frail, premature infant for a higher divine purpose. He truly believed he was the chosen one.
The chosen one, which makes the next part of his life sound like a political thriller. Let's set the scene again. By day, Isaac Newton is the model citizen. He is the quiet, brilliant, highly respected Lucasian professor of mathematics at Trinity College, Cambridge. He is the absolute pinnacle of the academic and religious establishment.
The pride of the university.
But by night, the sun goes down, and he is locking the heavy oak doors to his study. He is drawing the heavy curtains tightly shut, because the great Isaac Newton was keeping a secret that could have destroyed his entire life. He's a radical heretic.
Yes. Deep down, despite working at a college literally named Trinity, Newton was an Arian.
An Arian. Let's explain what that means.
Right. Arianism is a specific theological stance that emerged in the early days of Christianity and was officially deemed a heresy in the 4th century. Arians entirely rejected the concept of the Holy Trinity.
Why did he hate the Trinity so much? I mean, beyond just theological disagreements, why did it offend him personally?
Think about it from the perspective of a supreme mathematician who views God as the ultimate, indivisible absolute. The Orthodox view of the Trinity is that God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit are 3 distinct persons, yet simultaneously one single, indivisible God. 1 + 1 + 1 = 1.
And to a math guy, that's just wrong.
To Newton's fiercely logical, mathematical mind, this wasn't just a mystery of faith, it was a mathematical absurdity. It was a corruption of the absolute singularity of the Creator. He believed that this concept was a massive, sinister historical fraud cooked up by corrupt church councils in the 4th century to twist the original pure Word of God.
So how did he view Jesus then?
He viewed Jesus as a divine mediator, but absolutely subordinate to the Father, not equal to him.
And we have to emphasize the stakes here for you listening. If you are a professor at Cambridge in the late 1600s, you aren't just an academic. You are essentially a member of the Anglican clergy. You have to swear oaths to the Church of England. If someone breaks into that locked room and reads those manic, angry notes he was scribbling in the margins of his theology books, it is game over.
Immediate ruin. He would instantly lose his professorship. He would be stripped of his reputation, his income, his status. He would be cast out of polite society.
He'd lose everything.
In the 17th century, heretics weren't just fired, they were prosecuted. He could very easily lose his freedom and end up in prison, so he lived every single day of his life in a state of absolute suffocating paranoia. He trusted almost no one.
But he couldn't stop digging. He couldn't just keep his head down and teach math. Because, again, to Newton, the universe is a giant puzzle. The source mentions this beautiful, crazy concept of the 2 cryptograms. Walk me through that.
This is fundamental to understanding how his mind processed information. Newton believed that nature, the physical, material world, and the Bible were essentially 2 books written by the exact same author. God. And neither book was meant to be read plainly. They were both massive, masterfully designed cryptograms. They were complex ciphers that the creator had left behind, and the solutions to these ciphers were only meant to be discovered by a tiny, elite few.
The chosen ones, like a child born on Christmas Day who survived against all odds.
Exactly. Newton didn't see himself as a scientist. That word didn't even exist yet. They were called natural philosophers. But Newton saw himself as something older, a priest of nature. His sacred duty was to piece together the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient wisdom that had been given to humanity at the dawn of time, but had been lost, buried, and corrupted by centuries of religious and intellectual fraud.
This perfectly explains his obsession with the Book of Ezekiel and Solomon's Temple. I mean, if you look at his manuscripts, he was applying the exact same obsessive, pedantic mathematical precision that he used to calculate the orbits of comets to figuring out the exact floor plan of a biblical temple in Jerusalem.
Because he firmly believed that God did not dictate the dimensions of Solomon's temple by accident. To Newton's mind, the temple was a perfect architectural scale model of the entire universe.
That's incredible.
The proportions of the courtyards, the ratios of the walls. He believed that if he could just crack the geometry of the temple, it would literally reveal the mathematical laws that govern the motion of the planets. He spent years calculating the exact length of the sacred cubit, the unit of measurement used by the ancient Hebrews, because he thought it held the key to the circumference of the earth.
So it really was all the same language to him.
Math, geometry, boiling mercury, and decoding the Book of Revelation, they were all just different keys trying to unlock the exact same door.
And this leads to this incredible, terrifying concept he had of space itself. He didn't think space was just an empty void where planets happened to be floating. He called it the sensorium Dei.
The sensorium Dei, the infinite sensory organ of God. In Descartes' universe, space is just a container filled with bouncing particles. But Newton asked, how does an infinite omnipotent God actually manage and control the universe?
He has to interact with it somehow.
Right. He has to constantly feel it. He has to touch it. So space itself wasn't empty. It was sacred. It was the literal presence of God's spirit permeating every inch of reality. Space is how God perceives the universe.
And it's this exact theological conviction that God's invisible spirit is everywhere, actively holding things together, that finally allowed him to accept the terrifying concept of gravity. The planets don't need physical ropes to stay in orbit because they are moving within the very mind and sensory organ of God.
Precisely. His deepest scientific breakthrough was fundamentally a theological one.
But the irony that I cannot get over is that he is totally fine keeping all of this to himself. He is perfectly happy living his entire life as a paranoid hermit, locking his doors, boiling toxic metals, decoding Bibles, and doing the greatest math in history in total secret.
He was perfectly content with that.
If left alone, he never would have published. So how did the world ever find out about the physical laws that govern our reality?
It all started with a bet over coffee.
I love this part. It is so incredibly human. Let's move to London. The year is 1684. We are in a bustling, smoky London coffee house. The coffee house culture in 1680s London is basically the internet of the era.
Oh, totally. The hub of all information.
It's where the smartest, most ambitious people gather to argue, trade stocks, debate philosophy. And sitting around a wooden table are three of the most influential minds of the era. The great architect Christopher Wren, the brilliant polymath Robert Hooke, and a young, very ambitious, very wealthy astronomer named Edmund Halley.
And they are arguing. They are arguing about the holy grail of astronomy at the time. What is the exact mathematical force that holds the planets in their elliptical orbits around the sun? Johannes Kepler had already proven that orbits were ellipses, not perfect circles, but why?
Right. They knew the shape, but not the cause.
All three of these men at the table strongly suspect that it's an attractive force from the sun that decreases with the square of the distance, that inverse square law we mentioned earlier.
They have the vibe. They have the intuition, but they don't have the proof. Why couldn't Robert Hooke do it? He was supposedly a genius.
Hooke was a brilliant experimentalist and intuitionist, but none of them possessed the sheer, raw mathematical horsepower required to geometrically prove what shape a planetary orbit would take under that specific, continuously changing force.
Because they didn't have calculus.
Exactly. To do that, you need calculus. And no one knows calculus exists yet because Newton has it locked in a drawer. So Christopher Wren, being a wealthy gentleman, puts his money where his mouth is. He offers a cash prize, a book worth 40 shillings, which was a decent sum to whoever can bring him the mathematical proof within 2 months.
2 months go by. Hooke can't do it. Halley can't do it. So young Edmund Halley remembers something. He remembers that up in Cambridge, there is this incredibly eccentric, completely silent professor of mathematics who is rumored to be pretty good with numbers.
A bit of an understatement.
Just a bit.
Yeah.
So in August of 1684, Halley makes the trip to Cambridge. He knocks on Newton's door, walks into his study, and asks him the million-dollar question. What shape would a planet's orbit be if it were pulled by a force inversely proportional to the square of its distance from the sun?
Halley is expecting a long, agonizing debate. He's expecting chin-stroking, maybe a proposal to co-author a study, and Newton barely even looks up from his desk. He just instantly, casually replies, an ellipse.
Halley is stunned. He says, "How do you know that?" And Newton just shrugs and says, "I calculated it."
He calculated it almost 20 years ago during the plague and shoved it in a drawer.
It's absurd. The greatest scientific minds in the world are losing sleep, betting money, tearing their hair out over this problem, and Newton acts like Halley just asked him what the weather was going to be like tomorrow.
Like it's trivial.
But then, the punchline of the century. Halley says, "Show me the proof." And Newton starts digging through his chaotic, messy piles of paper, his alchemical notes, his biblical timelines, and he can't find it. The man lost the piece of paper that explains the literal universe.
He had completely misplaced it amidst piles of theological rants and recipes for the philosopher's stone. But he sees how desperate Halley is, and he doesn't want him to leave empty-handed. So Newton makes a casual promise. He says, "Don't worry, I'll sit down, redo the math from scratch, and send it to you in London."
And that casual little promise completely breaks Newton's brain in the best way possible. It triggers what can only be described as an 18-month manic fugue state.
The sleeping lion is finally awake. What was supposed to be a quick, few-page mathematical proof for a coffeehouse bet spirals into an all-consuming obsession. He locks himself in his room again. He stops eating. He barely sleeps.
Just working nonstop.
When he does sleep, it's only for an hour or two fully clothed in a chair. The historical accounts from his assistants say that his cat grew incredibly fat just from eating all the untouched meals that were left on his trays outside the door. For a year and a half, his mind is operating at a level of sustained manic genius that is hard for us to even comprehend. He is literally building the architectural framework of the entire cosmos from scratch.
And we have to give a massive shout out to Edmund Halley here. The source calls him the midwife of modern physics, and that's the perfect title. While Newton is having this manic episode, Halley is managing him. He is constantly writing to him, calming him down, begging him not to quit.
Because Newton was so unstable.
Exactly. Newton is deeply paranoid, and every time he hears a rumor that Robert Hooke is trying to take credit, Newton threatens to burn the manuscript and cancel the whole project. Halley has to flatter him, soothe his ego, and keep him focused.
Halley deserves half the credit just for keeping Newton sane enough to finish it. And the best part, when the massive manuscript is finally ready, Halley takes it to the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious scientific body in the world, and they tell him they can't afford to print it.
I burst out laughing when I read this in the source. Why were they broke?
The Royal Society had entirely bankrupted itself, printing an obscure, massive, very expensive, and completely unsellable encyclopedia about the history of fish.
The history of fish.
They literally had no money left for the laws of physics.
It's just the greatest historical absurdity. They blew the budget on a fish book so they can't print gravity. So Halley, bless him, actually pays for the printing of Newton's masterpiece out of his own pocket.
And thank God he did. Because in 1687, this massive, dense book written entirely in strict Latin finally drops in London. It's called the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, the Principia.
So the book drops, and you'd think the world would instantly recognize it as the foundation of modern science, right?
Yeah.
The brilliant minds of continental Europe, guys like Christian Huygens and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, they crack open this massive tome.
They're expecting a mechanical masterpiece.
Right. They are expecting the great Cambridge professor to finally explain the hidden gears, the invisible etheric whirlpools, the physical pulleys that make the Cartesian clockwork universe run. But instead, they read it, and they are horrified.
It was an ontological scandal, because what Newton is proposing in the Principia is that the massive sun and the distant Earth are pulling on each other across millions of miles of absolutely empty space. He mathematically proves the vacuum of space. There are no invisible particles bumping into each other. There are no gears. There are no etheric whirlpools pushing the planets along.
He is proposing action at a distance. And to a rationalist like Leibniz, this is utterly unacceptable. It's a massive step backward into the Dark Ages. Leibniz essentially accuses Newton of trying to smuggle voodoo back into science.
Well, put yourself in Leibniz's shoes.
Right. Imagine you're Leibniz reading this. You've spent your whole life accepting that things only move when pushed. And here comes this English recluse telling you the sun is pulling the Earth across millions of miles of empty space with an invisible tether. You'd think he was crazy too.
Leibniz's criticism is incredibly sharp and, frankly, completely logical from a mechanical standpoint. He basically says that Newton's concept of gravity is as absurd and superstitious as claiming you can assassinate your enemy across the ocean by stabbing a wax doll with a pin.
It's just magic to him.
It's pure sympathetic magic. How can matter act where it does not exist? How can the Earth affect the moon if it isn't touching the moon?
So, Newton is backed into a corner. He is being mocked by the intellectual elites of Europe as a mystic who is peddling magic. How does he defend himself without revealing that he actually is a mystic who believes in magical active principles and the sensorium Dei?
He defends himself with a 3-word shield that completely, permanently alters the trajectory of human thought. In the second edition of the Principia, in response to the massive criticism, Newton writes, hypotheses non fingo.
I frame no hypotheses.
Right.
Or I don't make up hypotheses.
Exactly. With those three words, Newton executes one of the boldest, most consequential epistemological pivots in history. He openly admits to Leibniz and Huygens, you're right, I have absolutely no idea what gravity physically is. I don't know the mechanical cause of it, and I refuse to invent a fairy tale or a fake etheric fluid to try and explain it. But, and this is the genius part, it doesn't matter.
Wait, why doesn't it matter?
Because, Newton argues, the mathematics prove with absolute undeniable certainty that this invisible force exists, and the mathematics predict exactly how it behaves. I can tell you exactly where Jupiter will be in the sky 10 years from now, down to the arc second. The math works perfectly. Therefore, we don't need to know the mechanical, physical cause to utilize the reality of it.
This is such a deep, profound insight. This is the exact moment modern physics is born. Because Newton takes this magical, alchemical, active principle, this invisible spirit he was desperately looking for while inhaling fumes in his shed, and he disguises it. He dresses this magical concept up in the cold, impenetrable, elegant armor of geometry.
It's a brilliant sleight of hand. The alchemical miracle of action at a distance is rebranded as a dry mathematical postulate, and doing so, science fundamentally decoupled from philosophy.
That's a huge shift.
Massive. Before Newton, natural philosophy was obsessed with asking why things happen in the universe. What is the fundamental essence of matter? Newton said, I don't know, and I don't care. Science abandoned the philosophical burden of asking why and settled for the immense predictive power of calculating exactly how things happen.
We don't know what it is, but we can measure it, so let's move on. That is the foundation of the modern technological world. We still don't truly know what gravity is at a quantum level, but we know how it works well enough to land a rover on Mars.
Exactly. Newton gave us the permission to measure the universe without having to understand its soul.
But the crazy thing is, Newton himself wasn't done. He completely revolutionized the macrocosmos, but he still had that alchemical itch. If he couldn't explain the soul of the universe in the vacuum of space, he was going to look for it in the very thing that illuminates space: light.
Which leads us to his second great masterwork, the Optics, which he finally publishes in 1704. And the delay in publishing is the perfect window into Newton's extreme, almost pathological pettiness.
Oh, he was so petty. It's almost funny if it wasn't so mean.
He had actually done the foundational work on light decades earlier, back during the Plague Year. But his great rival, Robert Hooke, the guy from the coffeehouse bet, had dared to publicly criticize some of Newton's early optical experiments in front of the Royal Society.
And Newton couldn't let it go.
Never. Newton was so thin-skinned, so deeply paranoid and resentful of any criticism that he absolutely refused to publish his definitive book on light until Robert Hooke was dead. He literally waited until Hooke was safely buried under the turf before he released the optics to the world, ensuring Hooke could never argue back.
And when you read about how Newton gathered his data for this book, it is genuinely horrifying. It really highlights the obsessive, borderline sadistic lengths he would go to for raw data. I'm going to warn you, if you're listening, this is visceral. To figure out how the human eye perceives color and light, Newton didn't just dissect cow eyes. He took a bodkin, a blunt, thick, leather-working needle, and he shoved this needle right into his own eye socket. He slid it right between his actual eyeball and the bone of his eye socket.
Oh my God.
Pressing into the back of his own eye, deliberately distorting the retina, just to see what kind of colored rings and visual distortions it would produce under different pressures. He took notes while doing this to himself.
He is literally risking permanently blinding himself just for raw data. He's sitting alone in his room, poking his own brain with a needle, taking detailed notes.
It demonstrates a level of commitment and a total disregard for his own physical body that borders on the fanatical. He treated his own body as just another piece of experimental apparatus. But what's truly fascinating about the optics isn't the eyeball torture, it's the back of the book.
The queries.
Yes. The Principia was a fortress of strict, unforgiving mathematics. He told the world, I don't make hypotheses. He wore the mask of the rationalist perfectly. But the optics is different. At the very end of the book, he includes a section simply called queries or questions. And in this section, the mathematical armor comes off. The strict Cambridge professor steps aside, and the old alchemist steps right back into the light.
He just starts wilding out in the back of the books like a scientific brain dump.
He completely lets go of his own rule. He starts freely and wildly speculating about the hidden nature of matter. He hypothesizes about invisible, attractive, and repulsive forces acting between tiny, invisible atoms. He talks about the ether. He explicitly talks about those active principles that permeate the universe.
The stuff from his shed.
Exactly. He essentially uses the back pages of his highly respected physics book to return to the search for the hidden soul of nature, the exact thing he was looking for in his melting pots.
It's like he couldn't help himself. He built the rational world, but his heart still belonged to the magic. But here's the tragic reality. You cannot live like this forever. You cannot inhale toxic heavy metals, stay awake for weeks on end, obsess over biblical ciphers, poke needles in your eyes, and live in constant paranoid fear of being outed as a heretic without something inside you breaking. And in 1693, the machine finally breaks.
Newton suffers a massive, terrifying nervous breakdown. His mind essentially short-circuits. He falls into a state of profound clinical depression, insomnia, and acute aggressive paranoia.
He just snapped.
He starts writing these deeply delusional, aggressive letters to his few remaining friends, like the philosopher John Locke and the famous diarist Samuel Pepys. He accuses them of plotting against him, of trying to ruin him, of trying to embroil him with women, and even trying to have him killed. He completely loses his grip on reality.
We actually have a pretty good scientific idea of why this happened, right? It wasn't just psychological stress.
It was likely physiological as well. Modern forensic analysis of preserved strands of Newton's hair has revealed massive, off-the-chart spikes in mercury, lead, and arsenic levels. Now, some historians debate whether the contamination could have happened later in life, but the most logical, immediate explanation is right there in the alchemical shed.
The toxic sludge.
The magus who spent years leaning over boiling pots of mercury, tasting toxic sludge in a desperate attempt to find divine truth, almost certainly poisoned his own nervous system into a state of near madness.
He flew too close to the sun, and his brain got poisoned by the very materials he thought would lead him to God. This breakdown is a major turning point in his life. He survives it, but he realizes he can't survive in the isolated, toxic echo chamber of Cambridge anymore. He needs a change. So, he abandons the university, he takes off the worn-out robes of a solitary scholar, and he moves to London to enter the center of political and financial power. And this move results in the greatest, most darkly comedic irony of his entire life.
It really is incredible. Think about Newton's history. The man who spent decades of his life in absolute secrecy, illegally boiling toxic sludge in a desperate alchemical attempt to use the philosopher's stone to manufacture fake gold.
Right.
He is appointed by the British government as the warden and later the master of the Royal Mint. They take the secret alchemist and put him in charge of all the real gold and silver in the British Empire.
You literally cannot write a better script than that. Hey, you spent 20 years trying to fake gold. Great, you're in charge of the economy. But he doesn't just treat it as a cushy retirement gig, does he?
Yeah.
The intense, rational, calculating, paranoid part of his brain just pivots. He stops hunting the laws of physics, and he starts hunting human beings.
Exactly. When Newton took over, the British economy was in a state of absolute crisis due to counterfeiting and clipping, where people would shave off the edges of silver coins, melt the shavings down, and pass the clipped coin off at full value. The currency was collapsing.
So what did he do?
Newton approached this economic crisis with the same terrifying pedantry he applied to planetary orbits. He completely reorganized the mint. But more chillingly, he became an utterly ruthless law enforcement officer.
How ruthless are we talking?
He organized a vast undercover network of spies and informants. He personally tracked down counterfeiters in the darkest, most dangerous slums of London. He would sit in taverns in disguise. He personally interrogated suspects using psychological pressure to get them to turn on their bosses.
Wow, he was acting like an 18th century detective.
And he showed absolutely zero mercy. The penalty for counterfeiting was death, and Newton aggressively pursued it. He sent dozens of men and women to be hanged at the gallows. The rational mind of the great scientist became a brutal, incredibly efficient executioner for the state.
It's a chilling transformation. From a guy looking for the soul of the universe to a guy sending people to the hangman. And that autocratic, dictatorial streak carried over when he was appointed president of the Royal Society. He ruled the scientific establishment like a petty tyrant.
Which brings us back to his old continental enemy, Leibniz.
The calculus dispute. This is widely considered one of the ugliest, most bitter feuds in the entire history of science. Both Newton and Leibniz had invented infinitesimal calculus completely independently of one another. Newton had actually invented it first, back during his plague year at Woolsthorpe, but because of his extreme paranoia, he hid it in a drawer for decades.
And Leibniz published first. Leibniz invented it years later, but he actually published it first, and he developed a much more elegant, usable notation system, which is actually the notation we still use today.
And Newton absolutely loses his mind over this.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough for Newton to just prove he did it first. His Messiah complex demanded that he utterly destroy Leibniz's reputation.
He couldn't abide sharing the glory. So Newton, utilizing his supreme power as president of the Royal Society, declares that the society must settle this dispute once and for all. He sets up an independent, impartial commission of scientists to investigate the matter and rule on who is the true inventor of calculus.
Let me guess, it wasn't independent.
Not even slightly. Newton secretly stacked the committee with his own sycophants and loyalists. But it gets worse. When the committee's final official report was published, a report that fiercely defended Newton, praised his singular genius, and officially branded Leibniz as a fraud and a plagiarist, the report was published anonymously. But historical analysis proved that Newton actually secretly wrote the entire report himself. He was the judge, jury, and executioner. He used the immense institutional power of his office to completely crush his rival. Leibniz died a few years later, largely disgraced, while Newton reigned supreme.
It is just so incredibly petty. The man who decoded the heavens, the man who calculated the weight of the sun, is down in the mud rigging bureaucratic committees just to stroke his own ego. But as we arrive at the grand finale of this deep dive, we have to talk about the ultimate historical irony of Newton's life. It goes way beyond his personal feuds or his vanity. It's about what his math actually did to the God he loved so much.
To understand this final irony, we have to look at how Newton felt about his own clockwork universe in his later years. When Newton looked up at the night sky, he didn't see a machine that could just run perfectly on its own forever. In fact, his own equations proved to him that the solar system was inherently flawed.
Flawed how? Like the math didn't add up.
The math added up, but the physical reality it described was chaotic. His math showed that the massive planets, particularly Jupiter and Saturn, were constantly tugging on each other with their massive gravity as they orbited the sun. Furthermore, comets were constantly zipping through the inner solar system, their gravity subtly disturbing the delicate balance of the planetary orbits.
So it's not a perfect, stable loop.
Right. According to Newton's own calculations, these accumulating gravitational wobbles meant that the solar system was inherently unstable. Left to its own devices, these wobbles would amplify over time, and the planets would eventually either crash into the sun or be flung out into the freezing void of deep space. The system would inevitably collapse.
Now, most physicists today would look at that math and be terrified. They'd think, oh no, my system is broken, I made a mistake. But Newton didn't think he made a mistake. He loved it.
He absolutely loved this flaw. It was the crowning theological achievement of his life. To him, the instability of the solar system was the ultimate proof he had been looking for since his days in the alchemical shed. It proved that God had to exist as an active, celestial mechanic.
Because someone had to fix it.
Exactly. Because the system was mathematically proven to be unstable, God had to occasionally step in, touch the universe, and adjust the gears to keep the planets in their proper orbits. His math didn't banish God. To Newton's mind, his math mathematically proved the absolute necessity of God's constant, tangible touch. He proved that Descartes was wrong. God wasn't retired. God was actively keeping the universe from falling apart.
He thought he had won. He thought he had used the most rigorous science ever invented to build a permanent, impenetrable mathematical fortress for God. But then, we roll the clock forward a century. We enter the heights of the French Enlightenment, and a new generation of brilliant thinkers takes hold of Newton's math.
These are men of a completely different era. They have never set foot inside a suffocating alchemy shed. They have never breathed in mercury fumes. They actively despise biblical ciphers and religious mysticism. They view religion as the enemy of reason.
They're pure rationalists.
And they take Newton's grand rule. Hypotheses non fingo, I make no hypotheses. And they apply it ruthlessly to Newton himself. They strip away all of his theology. They strip away the magic, the active principles, the sensorium Dei. They don't care about his God. They just keep the cold, hard, beautiful differential equations.
And this brings us to a French mathematician named Pierre-Simon Laplace. Laplace takes Newton's equations, and over many years, he perfects them. He pushes the calculus further than Newton ever could. He develops complex perturbation theory. And what does Laplace find when he runs the numbers on Jupiter and Saturn?
Laplace proves with exquisite, undeniable mathematical precision that Newton was wrong about the instability. Laplace shows that, yes, the planets wobble and tug on each other, but they operate on incredibly long periodic cycles.
Like a pendulum.
Exactly. Over vast expanses of time over millennia, those wobbles perfectly cancel each other out. A pull in one direction is eventually countered by a pull in the opposite direction. It acts like a grand cosmic pendulum. The solar system is, in fact, a perfectly stable, self-correcting mechanism.
It doesn't need to be fixed. It never did.
It doesn't need a celestial mechanic to come in and adjust the gears. The universe runs perfectly, flawlessly, eternally on its own.
Which leads to the punchline of history, the ultimate narrative beat. In 1799, Laplace finishes his monumental 5-volume masterwork on celestial mechanics. He has mapped the entire universe using pure Newtonian math, and he takes it to the Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. He proudly hands these massive books to Napoleon.
And Napoleon had some thoughts.
Right. Napoleon, who'd like to fancy himself an intellectual and knew a bit about Newton's belief in God, flips through the massive volumes. He looks at Laplace and says, "Monsieur Laplace, they tell me you have written this massive book on the system of the universe, and you have not mentioned its creator once."
And Laplace looks calmly at the Emperor of France and delivers what is perhaps the most devastating, legendary line in the entire history of science. "Sire, I had no need of that hypothesis."
I had no need of that hypothesis. It genuinely gives me chills.
It is the ultimate tragic paradox of Isaac Newton's existence. Think deeply about the life we just explored. Here's a man who was the last great magus, a man who sacrificed his physical health, his sanity, and his personal relationships.
His literal eyeballs.
Yes, a man who nearly blinded himself and poisoned his own nervous system with heavy metals, all in a desperate, obsessive, lifelong quest to find undeniable proof of God's tangible, active presence in the physical world.
And doing so, in his desperate attempt to prove God's existence, he accidentally forged the exact mathematical weapon that the modern world would use to evict God from the universe entirely. He gave them the tools to disenchant the world.
He built the machine that made his own magic obsolete. The quest for the divine fire birthed the cold, mechanical reality we live in today.
That is it's a profound tragedy, but it's also a testament to how utterly complex human progress really is. We've gone from a toxic, unbreathable shed in Cambridge to the quiet auction halls of Sotheby's, through plague years and coffeehouse bets, to arrive at a universe where gravity rules and the magus is forgotten. I want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into Sajo Delinc's fascinating work. It really flips our entire understanding of rationality completely upside down when you actually look closely at the messy, sweaty, paranoid, magical history of how these ideas were born.
It shows us that history is never a straight line from ignorance to reason. It's a tangled web of obsessions, irrational beliefs, and profound unintended consequences. Science wasn't born from a clean break with magic. It was born directly from the womb of magic.
And it leaves me with one final provocative thought that I want you to mull over as you go about your day. We look back at Newton from our modern vantage point and we laugh at the alchemy. We roll our eyes at the dragons and the green lions. But it makes you wonder about the tech visionaries, the brilliant scientists, the AI developers of our time.
That's a great point.
We see their polished apps. We see their reusable rockets landing perfectly on barges. We read their peer-reviewed papers. But what are their hidden alchemical sheds? What completely irrational, bizarre, or even magical beliefs are secretly driving the people who are building the future right now? Are they trying to build a digital god? Are they trying to escape death? It's a humbling reminder that the most pristine, world-changing logic might just be born from the strangest magic. Until next time, keep jiving deep.